So we're all really thrilled to be here. I'm really excited to get started. Might turn this way a little bit. So first I'm just gonna have the panelists each introduce yourselves, and if you might want to tell us, start with a point in your own careers or lives that really was instrumental in your own leadership role, whether it was a mentor, a moment of inspiration, or what it was. Let's start. Michael.
Yeah, Mike Watson from Eightfold. Nice to see you all today. Prior to joining Eightfold, which is an artificial intelligence company, I spent the first 25 years of my career in talent acquisition for companies like Western Digital, Workday, to just name a couple. And I look back, and there was really one woman that gave me a shot. It was my CHRO at Polycom at the time, Ashley Goldsmith. She then left and became the CHRO, the current CHRO of Workday. So I've worked with her twice. I think the biggest lesson is don't burn a bridge. You never know where these folks are going to end up. So yeah, I still tap Ashley on the shoulder from time to time to ask her for advice, and she's been fantastic.
Let's just move down the road.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm Marissa Waldman. I am the founder and CEO of Leaderology. We are a leadership development consulting firm headquartered here in Southern California. I think that my generation is full of women who are highly educated, but the minute they had kids, they chose to stay home. And as a mother of three and a wife of a physician, societal expectations were that I would stay home and I would prioritize the family. And it was hard back then. I was lonely in my career. I didn't have mentors. There weren't a lot of women who were interested in sort of turning around and giving me a hand up. And so the real turning point and realization in my career came when I was about 40. And I started seeing this next generation of moms coming up who were scared and lonely and were looking for mentorship. And so I put a hand out and was comfortable and excited to mentor them. But what I didn't realize, and I came to realize through that process, was that they ended up mentoring me. And those amazing, amazing women that I needed were there for me at that point in my career. And so as Michelle Obama puts it, reverse mentoring is something that I really am passionate about and cherish.
Hi, Christina, Glennon, head of DE&I programs and operations for Levi Strauss. Prior to Levi Strauss, I worked for Yum Brands, also for Starbucks. I also see a former colleague from Sears Holdings, so I have a love for consumer brands, and I also had a few years doing some swashbuckling adventures in nonprofit. And I think the common denominator in all of the careers that, or all the jobs that I've had, is that I've been able to be helpful. And part of the reason I feel that's important to me in the work that I do comes from being a really young girl, being raised by my mother who immigrated to this country at a very young age and being put to work at about 5 years old as her translator. So many of us can relate to that, where she'd be like, Christina, call the doctor and make an appointment. Christina, call the phone company and dispute this bill. And I'd go with her to her doctor's appointments and, and talk about or translate how she feels. And so from a very young age, she made an advocate out of me. And so I've been able to carry that value throughout my career. And it's so important to me. And I thank her for making me dispute those phone bills.
Thank you. Kimberley.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kimberley Fernandes, and I'm the Vice President of Learning and Organizational Development at the wonderful company. So excited to be here with you. I reflected a lot on this question. I pay attention a lot to language in my role, and so was there a turning point in which becoming a leader resonated with me? And I confess that there was no moment for me. What people tell me is I was one of those natural born leaders. As a little kid, I'm an extrovert's extrovert. So if there was a group of small kids to boss around, I was right there doing it. Don't worry, I learned the difference between being a boss and being bossy, I think. But I always have gravitated toward people and motivating them. And I think it's sort of funny and ironic that I made a career out of the adage, leaders are made, not born. And I do think that some of us have a natural inclination or a desire or a love and passion for it. And I'm really lucky that's guided me.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Darren?
Hi, everyone. Darren Chiappetta. I'm the head of employee relations and workforce compliance for Roku. Earlier in my career, I spent 20 years at Disney theme parks, and my first job was a Jungle Cruise skipper, if you know that attraction. Yeah, the jokes have never left. But I also reflected on this question, and my first management job actually was at Disney, at Walt Disney World in Florida. And the reason why I wanted to go into the role is because, and I'm hearing these wonderful stories about mentors and people that are inspiring. I had a terrible boss. And that was inspiring. Because I'm like, what do they do? They're not really doing it. What do you do here? So it kind of made me curious about, I think I could do that, probably. And honestly, my takeaway was, I'm gonna do what they didn't and see how that works for me. And it's actually worked quite well. So yeah, I think no matter what type of leader you have, you learn.
Great, thank you. All right, so how can a company create a culture where there's lots of different people that can envision themselves as leaders from the very beginning? And I'm gonna pick on you, Darren, to start this off.
Okay. Well, hopefully they've done their homework in advance of trying to get folks interested in the company. I mean, at the end of the day, seeing yourself in those positions is super empowering. It's also inclusive and inviting. So hopefully the C-suite has thought that through and create some robust programs. I think ERGs, DRGs, whatever we call them in some respects, can be a really great starting point. And I know we were chatting a little bit in the green room about after some of the things that have happened in society over the past couple of years, there's been programs and there's been kind of an outpouring of development type of programs and pipelines that can assist people to get to that leadership role. And I think it's really helpful that depending how companies use ERGs, DRGs, I've seen it a couple different ways. Some companies actually lean on their DRGs or ERGs as part of their business. So if they're, again, I spent 20 years at Disney, and the ERGs were a part of, if we're making a film that has a certain, connotation or a protected classification that there's a group, let's talk to you about it. So it starts them on the path of seeing that their voice actually matters. Plus they can do, leadership roles within the DRG. The one thing I always just caution people about is in our quest to make sure that we are highlighting or creating that pathway. What we never want to do though is make it look like the company is endorsing one layer of diversity versus another. Because one company that I worked for not too long ago, all well-meaning, incredibly well-intentioned, but to the point where there was employees from other resource groups that were not the specific demographic saying, are we not important? Where's my leadership program? So it's a delicate balance, obviously, but we want to make sure everyone feels welcome.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect thing to build off of, if I may, which is that you want to be very careful, again, about not having tokenistic strategies. And I know I'm talking to a room full of practitioners. And so in the 20 years that I've been doing DEI work, no organization has solved this, right? But the question begs sort of, I think, an obvious answer. If you have diverse employees, we all have diverse employees. I mean, everybody is different, right? And that's not to diminish the sort of strategic efforts we're doing to, build and cultivate underrepresented populations at the top, percentages of leadership or the top layers of leadership. But I think there's a fine line, and my response, I think, most authentic is from the wonderful company, where you really need to know the organization in which you work, right? What is your mission? What is your culture? Any strategy around leadership development or cultivating talent or setting standards for what excellence in DEI looks like has to be reflective of what your organization's goals are. I'm really proud that the wonderful company, and just 30 seconds, if those of you, I have my CSR report just so that my PR people know I get everything right. I know this is recorded, but we're 60% Hispanic organization, which is really unique. And still sort of the inherent tension I'm disclosing is the fact that most of our leaders are white men, right? So I'm very conscious that we're operating in this sort of dichotomous environment. We are trying to make good strides on that, but our company mission is about doing well by doing good. In other words, the way that we achieve profits and try to run our business is by giving back to the community. And so everything around cultivating talent, from the employees on the front line, in our production plants, in the fields, harvesting our fruit or our nuts, are given career pathways to develop into those leadership positions. So I can elaborate on that, but I think it has to be very endemic to the culture.
Well, that's kind of a perfect segue to, so you have all these companies with varying approaches and definitions to what inclusivity and diversity is. Maybe some, it's a focus on community. I'd love to hear from you how your companies define this and, as a value and why. Christina, let's start with you.
So it really emanates from our values. We have a really strong, unbelievable history of putting people first. And so our value of empathy really comes through in our DE&I programming, primarily in the way that we expect to captivate the hearts and minds of our leaders. So by helping them understand that they play a role in creating a culture of inclusion and helping them understand that it's a matter of self-accountability. We're not going to drive this work by way of compliance, because that way it's not believable. And then you run into that performative area where people are just showing up and ticking the box, but it's really, they're not self-enrolling in change, and the behaviors can't really back up what we're expecting them to do. So tapping into their hearts and minds and reminding them that we are a company that values empathy, I think that's been helpful in galvanizing our leaders to really believe in the work, and thereby it has a contagious effect where we're creating inclusion for each other. That leads to psychological safety, it leads to a strong sense of inclusion and belonging, and I think given that so many things can happen on any given day that disappoint us, looking to your workplace for that safe space where you can be yourself and receive the support that you need from your peers and from your leaders are one of the reasons that people stay with us. So to answer the question, it really comes down to tapping into empathy and helping people understand that inclusion is not simply about being polite and going, let's go for lunch, now I'm being inclusive. It's about understanding where you're coming from and what you carry with you into your workday. Because there is a lot that people are carrying with them into their day-to-day. And I think to sanitize the environment and expect people to leave it at the door is kind of false, and it's an impossible expectation. So by leaning into our values, I think that our leaders are representing that which we expect of them.
Okay. Some of us talked a little bit about this in the green room, but kind of where does this mandate for energetic, inclusive leadership come from? Is that like a C-suite thing? Is it a, entire culture? Is it a bottom up? In your companies, in your experience, what do you think? I'm gonna pick on you, Michael.
Yeah, I think when I look back at the companies I've worked for that have been successful, it did come from the top down. I've also worked for companies where it wasn't set from the top. And one of the things I used to say to my teams all the time is, if we can't control the culture of everyone in this company, at least we can control the culture in our team and our group. And our thought was, maybe other people will see that and they'll aspire to take that on. So I think it definitely comes from the board of directors, it comes from the C-suite. If it's lower than that, then you're just one person away from leaving the organization and everything changing. And that's why I think, not just having succession plans for the continuity of the business, but succession plans for ERGs, succession plans for diversity and inclusion, right? You have to have people that are ready to step up in those roles, because we all know, I think the average employee tenure these days is 3.5, 4 years at a job before you're moving on. So the only constant thing is change. So we have to be ready for that. We have to have plans in place to address that. So you don't lose a beat when someone leaves.
I think I would build on that and say that it starts with the culture. We're seeing it in the turnover. We're seeing it in unions and strikes. Culture's not putting up with this anymore. The employees are demanding change. They're demanding companies take a stand. Then we need the C-suite from the top to step forward and align with the company values in a way that isn't performative. As we all know, and we've heard this adage over and over again, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? Well, guess what? Leadership devours culture for lunch. And so we have to ensure that the culture that the employees are expecting, as the company has announced what their value, they have it on the wall, right? These are our values, this is what we care about, prove it. or we're going to hold you to account.
Thank you. Sorry. So how can organizations create pathways for employee growth to ensure that they have these skills and confidence to thrive as managers? I'm going to tap Christina.
Yeah. So I think avoiding a one-size-fits-all model. You have to be willing to meet people where they are. We've designed a development program based on 2 principles. First is on personalization. So making sure that you are understanding, if you are a people leader, you need to be a really great listener and understand what your employees need, what they expect, and find ways to provide that. So there's, learning on demand. We have LinkedIn learning. We have things that we've developed because our ERGs are telling us what they need. And since they represent the needs of the memberships, they can hold us accountable to making sure that we're avoiding that one-size-fits-all model. Most of us can speak on behalf of unconscious bias pretty well. But what about the behaviors that hold an organization accountable to preventing unconscious bias, being a great ally, knowing what to do when you experience or witness a microaggressive behavior. So all of those things are about upskilling our workforce so that they understand, how we expect them to show up, but also meet the individual needs that their teams are representing. The other thing is, I think we also all have to have a common understanding around what we mean by DE&I. So it's not, for us anyway, it's not by simply chasing the number, by simply chasing a metric or achieving a goal in representation, but it's about creating a culture that is ready to receive people from different walks of life so that they feel a sincere sense of belonging. And all of that, I'm confident in saying that most of our workforce has the will to achieve great things, but then it's the skill where we have to identify what are those gaps in their leadership, and we can provide a more bespoke model so that they can deliver what we expect. The next thing I'll say is we're really proud of our accelerator programs for women and BIPOC employees. We've heard the expression, they have often worked 3 and 4 times as hard as anybody else just to be treated fairly. So what they encounter in the workplace is different, and we've created accelerator programs to help them overcome some of the invisible barriers that stand in the way of their success.
Thank you. Kimberley, did you want to add to that?
I'm happy to add. I really agree with Christina's premise, right? It can't be a one-size-fits-all. I would say that's what makes our jobs so challenging and exhausting at times. I spoke about briefly that the wonderful company has a largely bifurcated workforce. So when it comes to leadership development, it's going to be very different on the island of Fiji, in the Central Valley. We're a global company. So not just the literal, needs assessment or learning needs, but, accessibility by way of language. Is there representation and visibility within the leadership chain so that all the cultural elements we talked about, right, that there's a feeling that I can be a leader. And so before we even create pathways to what, right? Everything that we talk about at the wonderful company related to career development or growth or some of the other topics we're addressing, I really think has to stem from, what's the business strategy in the next 3, 5, 10 years? How do you create those talent pipelines? And by doing career pathing in sort of a threefold manner, right? Do you have the systems in place, the organizational structures, policies, practices to support? Do you have the management and leadership that has that buy-in and real buy-in, right? I mean, there's so many leaders I know and love, but, maybe I mostly love, I don't know. But, you've got to really, really push and motivate them to walk the walk, not just have the talk, and then get employees to really feel engaged. I love the earlier panel that was talking about purpose and connection. I think if you can get employees to see that there's a place for themselves at the company, then that can stimulate everything else.
Can I add to that?
Please.
So I've said this a bazillion times, so if you've all heard me, I apologize. Show me a great leader, I'll show you someone who's self-aware. Show me a terrible leader, I'll show you someone who ain't so much. And it's critical that we help these leaders tap into their fearless authenticity. Number one, first and foremost, so that they can, in a very specific and intentional way, act in alignment and conviction with their values and their purpose. And then, most importantly, create safe spaces, psychologically safe spaces, so that others can do the same. And it's only then through that empathy, through that authenticity, through that understanding and aligning around purpose, can we ensure that everybody is getting what they need to grow and to be recognized in the organization.
So before we move on, Darren, I don't know if you
Yeah,
want
just real quick. I mean, I think it's also
given a lot.
important for companies to acknowledge that new leaders are not going to get it right. That they're not going to be perfect. They're going to step over themselves. They're going to trip over themselves. And so when you talk about that safe space, I think what's great is give them that space to fail. Tell them it's okay not to have every answer. I mean, you know, I remember my first management job, and there's a million times I had no idea what to do because it's not in the manual. You know, it's 1 week of training, and congratulations, you're knighted as a manager, right? Go make magic. That's what we did at Disney. And if you give them that space to ask questions, I think they're going to feel more confident about every time something comes up which you didn't plan for. They're not going to feel like, oh, I should have known that. Because you bestowed upon me the title of leader, I should have known that. No, give them that permission to understand. It takes a while to figure it all out.
And most companies, I think I said this already, most companies don't invest in new leaders for 4 years. So think about the damage. Think about the dead bodies that are happening, right? And there's what? To your point, that whole imposter syndrome where people are afraid to admit that they don't know. And I've coached, there was a young attorney who was leading people, and I coached her. I said, the next time we meet, you have to have at one time said, I don't know, but I'll find out. And she was like, I can't. I said, you can. You can. I don't know. I can guess. I don't know, and I'll find out. And she did it. And she didn't die. It was great.
So part of individual leadership development goes by different names. Some call it coaching, some call it mentoring or sponsorship. What do you emphasize at your company? Let's start with Marissa again, if you don't mind.
Whether, gosh, this is a good question. And as I think about this, I think about what we emphasize around leadership in leaderology, as well as with our clients. And it always starts with the individual. As I said, the most important piece is who am I as an individual, and what do I stand for, and how am I going to show up? So that's where we start. We move in from there into developing people so that they are focused on establishing very specific leadership SOPs is what we call them, so that they have a playbook that they've created that works for them. So it's not servant leadership, and it's not this leadership or whatever the flavor of the month is, but what is authentic to them as a leader, and what is the playbook that works best for them. And that's something that we've found has been successful globally, because it's not US centric. It's not, this is how a leader looks in the world. It's what is right for you in the context of your organization in a way that is authentic.
Kimberly?
Yeah, at Wonderful, I would say we focus on development holistically. So I wouldn't say we emphasize mentoring or coaching or formal training above anything else. We have what we call the Wonderful Way, which was modeled after the Toyota Way, manufacturing best practices. And so everything that we try to do from a development standpoint is predicated upon employees being empowered at the lowest level. So the philosophy is, basically if you're on a production line, right, that the person closest, to the job they're doing is going to be the one best positioned to identify the problem, come up with a solution. So going back to that cultural element, I think we really try to start there, where there's a development opportunity for everybody. And of course, some things are pushed down from the top, but we really encourage through this cultural element of continuous improvement, and again, a bottoms-up culture, that if you want to move from manufacturing to a more technical job, or if you want to become a supervisor, if you aspire to senior leadership, we even offer reverse language coaching. So not just Spanish speakers learning English, but English speakers learning Spanish, and so on and so forth. And so it is very much individualized kind of optionality. And I don't mean to make it sound idyllic. Nothing is perfect. But what I've been impressed in my almost 6 years at the company, and I come from media and tech, so this is kind of a new CPG world for me with learning and development. But it's amazing how, to your earlier point, Marissa, culture eats strategy. The culture is palpable. Like, the employee is first. The employee knows where the issues are. And so development then is just sort of second nature, right? Well, if that's the person that's best positioned to solve the problem, give them the development they need to go make that greatest impact. And I think that's something that gives us as practitioners a lot to work from.
Can I add that for organizations that have employee resource groups, please resource your resource groups and give them an operating budget so that they can bring some of the programs, some of those learnings, some of those keynote speakers to the communities that they represent. Development doesn't just have to depend on HR. making it a priority. Empower your ERG so they can bring that bespoke programming to their communities by way of giving them a very reasonable budget to do the good things.
Bespoke programming. That's beautiful.
You like that?
I like that.
Good, thank you. It's
So
not mine.
before we move on, Michael, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, so I agree with everyone here. I think one of the things that we can do as employers is identify the skills of successful leaders, right? And then lay out a plan for those folks to say, you're at A, you're trying to get to C, let's put a plan together so we can meet together, and B, integrate your learning and management system, take some courses, get a mentor that has some of those skills you're looking for. I think that's one of the biggest things we can do when we're building out future leaders is not just say, yeah, there's opportunity here, but lay out that roadmap of like, how do I get there? Like, what skills am I missing? What do I need to do? What courses do I need to take? And where I've seen that done at real well, the culture was amazing. And where it wasn't, you had people constantly coming into your office, tendering their resignation, saying, I don't see a future for me here.
If I could just jump in, sorry, Michael stimulated the thought. We all know the 70-20-10 model. And I was just thinking feedback, right? Like the best of like 1 month. Right? Like, I mean, the best development that our employees can get is on the job. And how do you get better at anything that you're doing is by having a feedback-rich culture.
And yes, +1 to that. And also, as we continue to make progress in representation, don't deny your BIPOC employees the feedback that they deserve to do better in their careers. We find that there's a little bit of a hesitancy to provide fair feedback because you don't want to say something that can be seen as not being inclusive or unfair. It is unfair when you deny your employees what they need to know to be excellent. So please practice radical candor wherever you can.
Thank you. Now I'm very curious about this next question. So social and political issues have put corporate America on the hot seat. You've got increasingly diverse workplaces that are demanding, or stakeholders and employees are demanding companies take a stand. We saw that with Disney. So my question to you is, how do companies align their corporate values with their employees and make sure that it's relevant and not just performative?
Can I just add one thing
Sure.
to that? You said the question was, we're putting corporations on the hot seat.
No, social and political issues.
Social and political issues. I would say that they put themselves on the hot seat.
Okay.
In 2010, the Supreme Court expanded the First Amendment to essentially give the same rights that a human gets to corporate America. And what came from that, Citizens United, I heard somebody say it, was a flood of cash out of corporate America into the political system. And it impacted policies and laws that weren't necessarily in the best interest of marginalized communities, of women. Don't get me started on the women thing. And so they started it, right? And we're gonna finish it. So when they put their toe in the water and said, actually, they didn't put their toe, they put their whole body in the water. And they said, here's the money, here's what we want. You don't get to then sit back and go, oh my gosh, you're expecting me to take a stand? Well, guess what? You are taking a stand. You're speaking with your dollars when you're supporting these people, and then there's gonna be an expectation coming back that you take a stand publicly. So, sorry on my soapbox. They started it. Society is going to finish it. And that's where the expectation comes from. So now, I would love to hear.
So I'm gonna
Snaps.
I do want to weigh in.
please do.
So I actually appreciate these corporate purity tests that organizations are being put through. It's important to me to work for an organization that really represents the needs of the people that we employ and the communities where we live. Performative allyship is real, and you're right in everything that you said. We believe in earning the right to speak up in the areas where we have already made a difference. So And we believe a company that stands up for everything is probably standing for nothing. So we have core areas where we have invested our resources, our leadership voice, and that is in the reproductive rights of women and body autonomy, voter rights, education, and obviously making sure that we are removing systemic barriers that stand in the way of our BIPOC employees. But we know that it is very trendy in this moment to speak up every single time that, you know, the world lets us down. But we created some discipline around those moments and are making sure that we use our voice, and when we speak up, we're doing it in a way that's believable, and we have earned the right to do so. And we're continuously earning and re-earning the right.
Darren, did you want to?
Yeah, it's kind of an ironic question because in my former life, employee relations at Disney, I covered Reedy Creek Improvement District. I was their leader for ER, which is, if you know, is kind of what's going on in Florida with the self-governing district that Disney had. I think my mic went off, but I'm very loud. Don't worry about it. So that whole situation, so it's really tough. It is, right? Because in that scenario, if you remember watching it or tracking it, the then CEO, Bob Chiappetta, did not want to get involved, wanted to take a neutral stance, and was pressured to do so by the employees, by the cast members, with obviously some interesting ramifications, right? One of the biggest things that I've seen with the emerging workforce is, I know we kind of covered it a little bit, is they demand a point of view, they demand action. The past 10 years, I guess you could say, I've had the pleasure of working for different studios and doing production HR and being on these sacred sound stages where people couldn't go. And at the end of the day, think back to the Ellen show, right? Think back, because social media is the great equalizer. It's one of these situations where if the studio or the company or someone doesn't do what they want, the outcome that they want, they're going to, kind of post it, so to speak. And it might, jump into an investigation and lead to different things. But all I can say is, and I'm actually thrilled about it, because there's behaviors that have been in the workplace for years that should never have been allowed to happen. And I love that the emerging workforce literally is not having any of it. So it is really a big part of what's going on. Yeah. And they don't want the companies to waver. They want the companies to take a stance.
Love it. So a follow-up on that, I'm curious. So in the wake of George Floyd, now I cover Hollywood, in particular, that industry, made public pronouncements, they launched initiatives, they hired DEI people. 3 years later, most of those initiatives have been dismantled, people have resigned, people have been let go. So I want to ask you sort of, what does this mean? The shift of thinking, was this performative? Did we make strides, and where do we go from here? Anybody?
I'll just jump in. I think when I think about that kind of trajectory and evolution, I think of the work that started is now being muted. And I don't know if it's being muted by COVID, the economy, any number of things, right, that's out there. But I do see that there is a little bit of a shift. And it's kind of putting on maintenance mode is the best way I could put it. It's muted, it's on maintenance mode. I'm not seeing a lot of really clever, unique things for meaningful change at this point. I think any one of us could try to figure out why that is. But I'm just trying to reflect on it. I don't have an answer for it other than to say it's a little bit more muted these days than it used to be.
Yeah, I think a lot of the things that we saw in 2020 post the George Floyd murder was reactionary. And it's hard to sustain that level of public outrage, right? I mean, I think we've probably struggled with it in our personal lives. We talked earlier about different kinds of fatigue. Many of us maybe have DEI strategy fatigue, right? It takes a lot of personal energy and commitment on behalf of a lot of people to make meaningful, sustainable change. And so I think my response to your characterization, which I think is accurate, is it was under false pretenses, right? It was just sort of pandering to the public and some of what the workforce wanted. I think companies that are making strides in an enduring way are doing it slowly and less publicly. I would put my company in that position. I do think that we address certain issues. I don't know if we have the discipline that you described on every issue, but I think we try to harken back to our values. We try to address things that affect the communities in which we serve, kind of the theme of what I've been sharing. And I think with our DEI efforts at the wonderful company, I would say it's slow. Like we take very slow, deliberate steps, and there's always somebody that you're disappointing, myself included, oftentimes when I want more radical change or speed change at better speed. But I don't want that outcome, right? And so how do you change culture? How do you change leaders that have been at the organization 20, 30 years? I just, again, I don't think we have a great solution, but I think anchor it back to the corporate values and recognize that change, meaningful change, takes time.
Yeah. I think that also some of my clients, for example, are like, we are not a DEIB firm, we're a leadership development firm, but all of our leadership development training has DEIB premises and positions woven throughout, because if you are a great leader, you are inclusive. If you are a great leader, you do embrace diversity. And so a lot of the clients we're working with are weaving these things. They're not being performative. They're not even putting it on the wall. They're weaving it in through all of the different things that they're doing, their programming.
And I think companies are reevaluating this, their strategies, especially if they were birthed in a time of crisis. Mm-hmm. Like now, they're balancing their DE&I agenda and considering more dimensions of diversity beyond race and gender, but thinking about veterans, thinking about people with disabilities and the different ways that people show neurodiversity. Yeah. Thank you. And finding ways to create programs that meet the needs of their diverse workforce. So I think it's more of a reevaluation time. I'm hopeful that we will see a continuation of programming and resourcing of DE&I. But when you create multiple entry points for people to self-enroll in DE&I and improve their behaviors and participate in change, I think that depends on having a more balanced agenda. For example, we talked about neurodiversity. Many people that we work with show up and have some kind of neurodivergence, but they're not receiving the leadership, or even the empathy to address that. So creating more ways for people to understand that diversity is not just visual, I think is really important. And I think responsible companies are recognizing that the moment is changing.
And even with vendors, I know that the clients I'm talking to are like that we are a women-owned business, that we are a diverse vendor. They're tracking and encouraging those behaviors as well, with those types of relationships.
Yeah, I think I hate to sound cynical here, but I think if you don't tie this to C-level compensation, it falls by the wayside, right? Executives pick up the flavor of the month. Oh, let's get on the bandwagon here. Let's champion this cause. But there's nothing tying them to that, right? They end up leaving. They get these golden parachutes and they're out the door. So I think if you really want to hold their feet to the fire, attach their compensation packages to these things, right? If the board of directors and you as the employee groups say these are important, then these are the metrics and these are the KPIs that the C-level executives should be held to. And if they don't hit those, they shouldn't get their bonuses and they shouldn't get these extravagant packages when they leave. I think if you start doing that, you'll start seeing a meaningful change.
So we literally have a minute and 30 seconds left. So I'll ask a quick question and anybody wants to pick it up. And thank you. So how does a focus on community, particularly for disadvantaged ones, create an opportunity for employees to practice leadership? I'm going to ping Darren.
Well, especially if the companies get involved in those communities, then even folks who might not have a leadership title in the company can assume leadership responsibilities and actually learn how to be a mentor. And it's incredibly rewarding, right? When you start to light that pathway up for that group that probably wouldn't necessarily have the same pathway. So there's a bunch of, I think, ways in which almost indirect leadership training based on getting involved in that.
Okay.
Yeah, the other thing I'd say on that is you don't have to be a people manager to be a leader. I know plenty of individual contributors that are leaders. They lead by example. They lead by the quality of their work. So if your organization is only looking for your leaders to provide these examples, I think your definition of leadership needs to be changed. I think you need to make sure your entire workforce knows that everyone in this organization can be a leader, right? From the assembly worker up to the C-level suite.
Well, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.